This is a story about a man who was once a loving husband and the terrible choice he made.
I can't wait to meet them.
Me neither. They're gonna be so loved.
It is a story about a young, pregnant woman who believed she was safe, and the moment she realized her home had become her prison. Her name was Ashley, and the man she loved, her husband Chad, was standing over her bed, his face a mask of cold, unfamiliar anger. Behind him, in the shadows of the doorway, stood his mother, Mildred, watching with a quiet, satisfied smile. What happens next will shock you. I promise you, this is a powerful and emotional story you will not want to skip. A story filled with life-altering lessons about the poison of manipulation and the tragic cost of broken trust. So please, get comfortable and let us begin. And if this is your first time with us, we invite you to subscribe and turn on your notification bell. And please, give this video a thumbs up if it moves you. The rain was beating against the bedroom window, each drop sounding like a tiny tapping finger. Inside, the room was cold. Ashley was lying in bed, curled under the blankets. A deep ache settled in her bones. She had just come home from the hospital that morning. The doctors had told her she needed to rest, that her body was weak, that the baby needed her to be still and calm. But there was no calm in this house anymore. Chad stood over her, his arms crossed. He did not look like the man she had married. The warmth was gone from his eyes. The gentle smile she had fallen in love with was replaced by a hard, thin line. "Get up," he said, his voice low and flat. "My mother and I are hungry. Go and make dinner." Ashley flinched. Every part of her body hurt. She could barely find the strength to lift her head from the pillow. "Chad, please," she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. "The doctor said I have to rest. I can't even stand up properly. I'm still so weak." From the doorway, Mildred made a small sound of disgust. "So lazy," she muttered, just loud enough for them both to hear. "When I was pregnant with you, son, I worked in the fields all day and still came home to cook a full meal for my father. This generation, they are just too soft." Chad's jaw tightened. His mother's words were like gasoline poured on a fire. He looked down at his wife, his sick, pregnant wife, and he felt no pity, only anger. "Did you hear me?" he said, his voice getting louder. "I said get up and cook." Tears welled in Ashley's eyes. This wasn't him. This wasn't the man who used to rub her feet when they were tired, the man who would make her tea every single morning. How did it come to this? How did the sunniest love she had ever known turn into this cold, dark storm? To understand, we must go back. We must go back to a time before the darkness came, a time when their little house was not a place of fear, but a palace of joy. Just 2 years ago, Ashley and Chad were the happiest couple you could ever meet. Their love was simple and pure. Ashley, an orphan who had lost her own mother and had no other family, felt like she had finally found her home in Chad's arms. He was her everything, her protector, her best friend, her family. He was gentle and kind, and he treated her like the most precious treasure in the world. Their happiness became complete when Ashley found out she was pregnant. Chad was overjoyed. He cried with happiness and kissed her belly, promising to be the best father in the world. Their future looked so bright, so full of hope. It was Chad who had the idea that started it all. Seeing Ashley so tired from the pregnancy, he suggested that his mother, Mildred, come to stay with him.
He thought she could help around the house to cook and clean so that Ashley could rest. To Ashley, who longed for a mother figure in her life, the idea sounded like a prayer answered. She welcomed Mildred into their home with an open and loving heart. She had no idea she was welcoming a sneak into her garden of happiness.
Mildred had never wanted Chad to marry an orphan with no money. She had her own plans, her own choice of a wife for her son, and she had secretly promised herself she would make Ashley's life a living hell. As long as Chad was home, Mildred was an angel. She was sweet, caring, and helpful. But the moment Chad's car pulled out of the driveway each morning, the angel disappeared, and a monster took her place. The cruelty was slow and methodical. It began with endless chores. Mildred would demand Ashley scrub the floors on her hands and knees, even as her pregnant belly grew larger. And when Ashley was finished, exhausted and in pain, Mildred would walk through the kitchen and accidentally spill a box of cereal or a jar of jam, and then stand over her, saying, "Look at this mess. You better clean it up." Ashley tried to please her. She worked until her back screamed in protest, hoping to win her mother-in-law's approval. But nothing was ever good enough. Mildred criticized her cleaning, her cooking, her very existence in that house. The worst part was how she poisoned Chad's mind. If Ashley ever tried to speak up, to gently tell Chad that his mother was making things difficult, Mildred would put on a show. She would burst into fake tears the moment Chad walked in, claiming that Ashley was being cruel to her, that she was ungrateful. And Chad, who had always known his mother as a strong, loving woman, believed her. He would turn on Ashley, his voice full of disappointment. "Why are you being so mean to my mother? She is only here to help you." The argument started, chipping away at their love day by day. Ashley felt so alone, so trapped. There was no one to turn to, no one to believe her. Then the cruelty escalated into something far more dangerous. Mildred started adding things to Ashley's drinks, a little bit of bleach in her water, or a few drops of chemical cleaner in her juice. Ashley started getting sick, horribly sick. She had terrible stomach pains and dizzy spells. She became weak and pale. Chad would take her to the hospital, and the doctors were always confused. They would find traces of harmful things in her system and warn Chad that his wife was being exposed to something dangerous at home. Ashley's heart grew cold with suspicion. She knew who it was. She tried to tell Chad, her voice trembling, I think it's your mother." But he exploded in anger. "How dare you?" he shouted. "My mother would never do such a thing. You are making up lies because you don't want her here." That was the turning point. From that day on, Chad stopped being her protector. He became her accuser. He started to believe that Ashley was lazy, that she was pretending to be sick to get attention. He stopped helping around the house. He stopped giving her money for food or for the bus to get to her hospital appointments. She, a heavily pregnant woman, would have to walk for miles, crying silently with each painful step. He started treating her like she was the maid. He would force her to wash his car, to do all the heavy lifting, to work from morning until night, while his mother sat and watched with a cold smile. Ashley's health got worse and worse, until one day she collapsed and had to be rushed to the hospital and admitted. Chad felt no pity. When the hospital called him, he said, "What is she doing that is so special? Every woman gets pregnant. Why is she so weak?" He paid the hospital bill, but his heart was hard and closed. And that brings us back to tonight, back to this cold, dark room with the rain lashing against the glass. Ashley, just hours home from the hospital, was being ordered to cook. "Please, Chad," he begged again, the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I can't. I am in so much pain. I can't even move my legs. Please, just for tonight, Can't you make a sandwich? I promise I will cook for you in the morning." "A sandwich?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "I am not a child. I want a real meal. A man comes home from a long day of work and he expects his wife to have a hot dinner on the table for him." "But I was in the hospital," she cried out, her voice breaking. "And now you are home," he said, his voice as cold as ice. He took a step closer to the bed. "I am done with your excuses. I am done with your laziness. Now I am telling you for the last time, get out of this bed and go cook me my dinner." She looked into his eyes, searching for the man she had married, the man who had promised to love and protect her. But he was gone. In his place was a stranger, a cruel stranger whose heart had been filled with his mother's poison. And, with the last bit of strength she had, she looked him in the eye and whispered one word: "No."
The word was so quiet, it was almost lost in the sound of the rain. No. It was not a word of defiance, it was a word of pure physical truth, a statement from a body that had already given everything it had, a body that had no more to give. Ashley's spirit had been broken weeks ago. Now only her body remained, and it was screaming that it could not go on. Chad heard it not as a plea, but as an attack, an insult, the ultimate disrespect. From the doorway, his mother Mildred saw her moment. She glided to his side, her presence like a shadow, and her voice was a sweet poison poured directly into his ear. "Did you hear that, my son? After all you do for her. When I was pregnant with you, I worked from sun up to sundown. I still made time to cook a hot meal for your father every single night. I never complained. I never made excuses. I did not break down from a simple fever. She is just lazy, too lazy." Her words were a key turning a lock in his mind, a lock that shut away all reason, all compassion, all memory of the love he once had for the woman in the bed. All that was left was a cold, hard rage. "My mother is right," he said, his voice flat and empty of all emotion. "You are just lazy." "That's not true," Ashley whispered, shaking her head on the pillow. The movement sent a wave of dizziness through her. "I'm sick, Chad. The baby. The doctor said I have to be careful." She thought the baby, their child, was a magic word that could save her. She was wrong. "You use that baby as an excuse for everything," he snarled, his voice suddenly loud and sharp. He leaned over the bed, his face close to hers. She could smell the anger on his breath. "I am sick of it. I am sick of you." "Chad, please." He didn't let her finish. He raised his hand. The slap was not just a sound. It was an explosion in the quiet room. It was the crack of a promise breaking. It was the end of everything. Ashley's head was thrown back against the headboard with a dull thud. A sharp, burning pain spread across her cheek, but it was nothing compared to the pain in her heart. In that one violent moment, the man she had married died. A cruel stranger was wearing his face. He stood over her, breathing hard, his hand still tingling. He looked down at the red mark blooming on her skin, and he felt nothing. No regret, no shame, only the cold, hard satisfaction of power. "This marriage is over," he stated, each word a nail in the coffin of their life together. "I want you out of my house, tonight." The words didn't make sense. out. Where would she go? He knew she had no one. He was her only one. This house was her only safe place in the world.
He turned to her closet and tore the doors open. He began to pull her clothes out, not caring as they fell from the hangers. He grabbed them by the handful and threw them to the floor. Mildred joined him, a grimly satisfied look on her face. She went to the dresser, pulling open drawers, dumping their contents. She picked up a small wooden box from Ashley's nightstand, the one holding the locket and faded photo of Ashley's mother. And without a moment's hesitation, she tossed it onto the growing pile of rejected things. "Please, no!" Ashley cried, a sound torn from her soul. "Not that! That's all I have of her!" They ignored her. They were a team, a destructive force working together. When the pile was big enough, Chad turned back to the bed. "Get up." He didn't wait for her to obey. He grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her soft skin like claws. He hauled her out of the bed. Her weak legs buckled, and she would have fallen if he wasn't holding her up with his cruel grip. The cold of the floorboards shocked her bare feet. He began to drag her. He dragged her from the bedroom, their sanctuary. He dragged her down the hallway, past the smiling photos of their wedding. Her body was a dead weight, and her bare feet scraped against the floor. "You're hurting me, Chad," she sobbed, the words ripped from her throat. "The baby! You're hurting the baby!" He did not reply. He did not even look at her. He was a man with a single, simple task: to remove the garbage from his house. At the front door, Mildred was already there, throwing Ashley's belongings out onto the porch, into the driving rain. Chad fumbled with the lock and pulled the door open. A wall of cold, wet air hit them. The night was a black, roaring monster of wind and rain. He dragged her over the threshold. With his free hand, he shoved her. She stumbled forward, landing on her knees on the cold, wet concrete of the porch, amidst the soaking pile of her clothes. She instinctively wrapped her arms around her belly. She turned, looking up at him from the ground, a desperate, final plea in her eyes. The rain was plastering her hair to her face, mixing with the tears that streamed down her cheeks. "Please, Chad, don't do this. I'm begging you. It's cold. The baby." He looked down at her, a pathetic, soaked creature at his feet. There was no pity in his eyes, only disgust. He saw his mother standing behind him, nodding, her face set like stone. It was all the approval he needed. He was about to slam the door shut, but one last vicious impulse, born from his mother's poison, took hold of him. He needed to hurt her one last time. He needed to make sure she understood that she was nothing. He drew back his foot, and he kicked his pregnant wife right in the stomach. The impact was a sickening thud. The air was stolen from Ashley's lungs in a silent scream. The force of the kick lifted her slightly and threw her sideways. She fell hard, and the side of her belly slammed against the sharp edge of the concrete porch step. A pain beyond all description, a white-hot, tearing agony ripped through her entire being. It was a pain that erased thought, that erased everything but pure animal suffering. Chad watched her fall. He watched her curl into a ball on the wet concrete. And then, without another look, he stepped back inside the house. He slammed the door shut. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was the loudest sound in the world. Outside, in the storm, Ashley lay broken. The rain washed over her, cold and merciless. She could feel a strange warmth spreading inside her, a terrible wetness that was not the rain. She cried out his name, but no sound came out. She was alone in the dark, with a pain so immense it felt like the world was ending. Her vision began to blur, the darkness of the night closing in, swallowing her whole. Her hand, which had been clutching her belly, fell limp at her side. And then there was only silence.
The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was a sound of finality, a heavy metallic click that separated the world into two parts, the warm, dry house and the cold, wet darkness outside. Inside, Chad stood with his back against the door, his chest heaving. His hand was still on the lock. For a moment, the only sound was his own ragged breathing and the relentless drumming of the rain against the roof. Mildred walked over to him and placed a soft, dry hand on his shoulder. Her touch was meant to be comforting, but it felt cold. "You did the right thing, my son," she said, her voice smooth and calm. "You showed her that you are the man of this house. She will learn her lesson now. She will learn to respect you." Chad nodded slowly, but he did not turn around. He was staring at the wooden door as if he could see through it. In his mind, he could see Ashley lying on the wet concrete. He could see the way she fell. He could hear the dull thud of her body hitting the step. He shook his head slightly, trying to push the image away. "She deserved it," he muttered, trying to convince himself. "She was disrespectful. She was lazy." "Exactly," Mildred said, patting his arm. "Now, let's forget about her. I am hungry. I will go and make us a nice hot dinner. We deserve it after all this drama." She walked away towards the kitchen, humming a little tune. She was happy. She had won. The orphan was gone, and she had her son all to herself again. Chad did not move. He finally took his hand off the door and walked into the living room. He sat down on the sofa, the very same sofa where he and Ashley used to cuddle and watch movies. The house felt strangely big now, and very, very quiet. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of the storm and the distant clatter of pots and pans as his mother began to cook. He picked up the remote and turned on the television. A bright, cheerful game show filled the screen. People were laughing and clapping. The sound felt wrong. It felt loud and intrusive in the heavy silence of his home. He turned the volume down until it was just a murmur. He could not focus on the screen. The image of Ashley's face, stained with tears and shock, kept flashing in his mind. The feeling of his foot connecting with her body. It was a phantom feeling, a ghost of an impact that made his own stomach clench. He told himself he was right. She had pushed him. She had said no. She had disrespected him in front of his mother. A man has to have rules in his own home. He was just teaching her a lesson. A hard lesson, yes, but one she needed to learn. From the kitchen, the smell of frying onions drifted into the living room. Usually, that smell made him feel hungry and comforted. Tonight, it made him feel sick. Mildred came into the room, wiping her hands on an apron. She was smiling. "Dinner is almost ready, son. You see how easy it is when you have a woman in the house who actually wants to take care of you?" Chad just nodded, his eyes still fixed on the blank television screen. "Aren't you going to eat?" she asked, her smile fading a little. "I'm not hungry," he said, his voice quiet. "Nonsense," she said, her voice becoming a little sharper. "You must eat. You need your strength." She went back to the kitchen. Time began to stretch and slow down. Every minute felt like an hour. The rain did not stop. It was a constant, accusing sound. He thought about Ashley, out there in the cold. Was she still on the porch? Had she gotten up and walked away? Where would she go?
He pictured her walking down the dark street, soaked and crying, with nowhere to go. A small, unfamiliar feeling began to prick at his heart. It felt like guilt. But he pushed it down. This was her fault. She had made her choice when she said no. Another 20 minutes passed. Mildred ate her dinner alone at the kitchen table. Chad did not move from the sofa. The game show ended and a news program began. He was not watching. He was listening to the rain. He thought, maybe I should just check, just to make sure she's gone. I'll just open the door for a second and look. He stood up. Where are you going? Mildred asked from the kitchen. Nowhere, just stretching my legs. He lied. He walked back to the front door. His hand hesitated over the knob. What if she was still there? What would he say? What if she was crying and begging him to let her back in? His mother would be so angry. Leave her out there, son, Mildred called out, as if she could read his mind. A little cold and rain won't hurt her. It will make her think about what she has done. He pulled his hand back from the door. His mother was right. He was being soft. He went back to the sofa and sat down. But the image in his head was getting worse. The way she fell. It wasn't a normal fall. It was heavy, limp, and the sound it made was not the sound of a person catching themselves. It was the sound of dead weight hitting concrete. He had kicked her. He had kicked her in the stomach. His pregnant wife, his baby, his own child was in there. What had he done? The small prick of guilt was no longer small. It was a giant, sharp knife twisting in his gut. The cold anger was gone, replaced by a cold rising tide of fear.
An hour had passed since he had slammed the door. An entire hour. He could not sit still any longer. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. I'm just going to check on her, he said, his voice louder than he intended. Chad, I told you to leave her be, Mildred said, coming to stand in the kitchen doorway. No, he said, shaking his head, a terrible urgency taking hold of him. Something's not right. I have to check. This time he did not hesitate. He walked to the door, his hands trembling as he turned the deadbolt. The click was loud and final, just as it had been an hour ago. He pulled the door open, and he saw her. She was still there. She had not moved. She was lying in a heap, in a large puddle of rainwater that was stained a dark, terrifying red. The rain had plastered her hair to her pale, still face. Her eyes were closed. She looked like a broken doll that someone had thrown away. Ashley, he whispered. His voice did not work properly. He stepped out onto the porch, his shoes splashing in the bloody water. The cold rain hit his face, but he did not feel it. He knelt beside her. Ashley, get up, he said, his voice shaking. He touched her arm. Her skin was cold. So cold, colder than the rain. He put his hand on her shoulder and shook her gently. Ashley! She did not respond. Her head just lolled to the side. Her face was a strange, waxy color under the dim light of the porch lamp. Panic, raw and absolute, seized him. He leaned down, putting his ear next to her mouth, listening for the sound of breathing. There was nothing, no warmth, no air, just a dead, cold silence. No, he breathed, no, 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 no! He pressed his shaking fingers against her neck, searching for a pulse, for any sign of life. He felt nothing, just cold, wet skin. A scream built in his throat, a scream of pure animal terror, but it wouldn't come out. He was frozen, kneeling in the rain and the blood, staring at the lifeless body of his wife.
From the doorway, Mildred watched, her hand over her mouth. The look of triumph was gone from her face, replaced by a pale, horrified shock. She had wanted to punish the girl, not this. Chad scrambled back, away from the body, slipping on the wet concrete. He pulled out his phone, his fingers so clumsy he could barely unlock it. He dialed the emergency number. "There's been an accident," he stammered to the operator, his voice a choked, unrecognizable thing. "My wife, she fell. She's not breathing. Please, you have to come now. Please, hurry!" He didn't remember the ambulance ride. It was a blur of flashing lights and screaming sirens. He sat in the back, watching the paramedics work on Ashley's still body, a flurry of desperate, urgent movements. At the hospital, they rushed her through a set of double doors, and he was left behind in a hallway that was too bright, too clean, and smelled of antiseptic. He and his mother were led to a small, empty waiting room. He collapsed into a plastic chair. Mildred sat beside him, silent and rigid. The minutes crawled by, each one an eternity of agonizing silence. Finally, a doctor came into the room. He was a tall man with tired, sad eyes. His green scrubs had small specks of blood on them. His name tag read Dr. Evans. He looked at Chad. His face was grim. There was no kindness in his expression, only a heavy professional weariness. "Mr. Henderson?" Dr. Evans said, his voice quiet but firm. Chad looked up, his heart a block of ice in his chest. "I'm so sorry," the doctor began, and Chad's world began to tilt on its axis. "We did everything we could, but the trauma was too severe. We lost the babies." Chad stared at him, uncomprehending. The word echoed in the silent room. "Babies?" he whispered. Dr. Evans slowly nodded. "Yes, your wife was carrying twins. I'm very sorry for your loss."
The word hung in the sterile air of the waiting room. Twins. It was not a word of joy. It was not a word of hope or of a future filled with laughter. It was a word that was a weapon. It was a word that struck Chad with the force of a physical blow, knocking the last bit of air from his lungs, breaking something deep inside him that could never be repaired. He had not just destroyed one life he had helped create, he had destroyed two. He stared at Dr. Evans, his mind a swirling fog of confusion and horror. "No," he stammered, shaking his head as if he could deny the reality of the words. "No, we didn't know. We only thought just one." Dr. Evans' expression did not change. There was no pity in his eyes, only a weary sadness. It's not uncommon to miss it in an early ultrasound. But yes, it was twins, a boy and a girl. A boy and a girl, a son and a daughter. He had wanted a son to teach how to play ball. Ashley had dreamed of a daughter, a little girl whose hair she could braid. They had talked about it, laughed about it, dreamed about it together on the sofa in their once happy home. And now, because of him, because of a moment of stupid, blind rage, they were gone. They had never even had a chance to breathe. Beside him, Mildred made a small choking sound. She put a trembling hand to her mouth, her face the color of ash. The reality of what had happened was crashing down on her too. Her cruel games, her whispers of poison, her desire to punish the girl her son had married, it had all led to this, the death of her own grandchildren. Chad could not breathe.
The walls of the small waiting room seemed to be closing in on him. He felt the desperate need to escape, to run away from this terrible room, from this doctor with the sad eyes, from the truth of what he had become. He was not a husband. He was not a father. He was a monster. He looked at the doctor, his eyes wild with a desperate new hope. "Ashley," he croaked, his voice raw. "My wife. Is she awake? Can I see her?" He had to see her. He had to tell her he was sorry. He had to beg for her forgiveness, even though he knew he did not deserve it. He needed her to be okay. He needed her to live so that some small piece of his soul would not be completely and utterly damned. Dr. Evans looked down at his clipboard, avoiding Chad's frantic gaze. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound Chad had ever heard. "Your wife suffered a massive internal hemorrhage. The fall, combined with a powerful direct blow to her abdomen, caused a placental abruption and ruptured her spleen. She lost a catastrophic amount of blood before the paramedics even arrived." Every word was a hammer blow, a powerful, direct blow. The doctor knew. He knew this was not a simple fall. "We managed to stabilize her in surgery," Dr. Evans continued, finally looking up. "But the blood loss was too great. Her brain was deprived of oxygen for too long. She has slipped into a coma." A coma. The word was both a relief and a new kind of terror. She was alive, but she was not there. She was trapped, somewhere in the darkness, somewhere he could not reach her. "We are doing everything we can," the doctor said, his voice softening just a fraction. "But I need you to be prepared. Her condition is extremely critical. The next 24 hours will tell us everything." He was telling him that she was going to die. He wasn't saying the words, but the meaning was there, hanging in the cold, sterile air. Chad felt his legs give way. He slumped back into the hard plastic chair, his body completely numb. He could feel none of his hands or his feet. He could only feel a vast, black, empty hole where his heart used to be. Mildred began to cry, not the loud, fake sobs she used to trick her son, but real, quiet, racking sobs of a woman who has finally seen the true face of the evil she has created. The sound was ugly and pathetic. Chad did not even look at her. The next 2 days were a blur of sleepless, silent horror. They did not go home. They stayed at the hospital in that cold, soulless waiting room. Nurses would come and go, their faces always a mask of professional sympathy. Chad would ask for an update, and the answer was always the same: no change. He was allowed to see her once. He had to put on a gown and a mask. He stood in the doorway of the intensive care unit, looking at her through a pane of glass.
This was not his Ashley. The woman in the bed was a stranger. Her face was pale and swollen, with a dark, ugly bruise on her cheek where his hand had struck her. Tubes and wires were coming out of her, connecting her to a crowd of beeping, sighing machines that were breathing for her, living for her. The only sound in the room was the steady, rhythmic whoosh of the ventilator, a machine that was doing the one thing her body could no longer do on its own. He looked at her still form, and the full, crushing weight of his actions finally broke him. A wave of nausea and self-loathing so powerful it made him physically sick washed over him. He had done this.
His hands, his foot, his anger, his weakness, he had turned his beautiful, vibrant wife into this broken thing, this collection of tubes and wires. He stumbled back from the window and ran to the men's room where he was violently ill. He knelt on the cold tile floor with nothing left in him but shame and a grief so profound it felt like it was dissolving him from the inside out. He did not speak to his mother. He could not even look at her. When he saw her sitting in the waiting room, her face red and puffy from crying, he felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred. This was her fault. She had planted the seeds of doubt and anger in his mind. She had whispered the poison in his ear. She had watered the evil inside him until it grew strong enough to kill. But he knew deep down that the fault was his own. She had given him the poison, but he was the one who had chosen to drink it. He was the one who had raised his hand. He was the one who had drawn back his foot. The monster was not just her. The monster was him. On the morning of the third day, Dr. Evans came to find them in the waiting room again. He did not need to say a word. The look on his face, a look of deep, profound sorrow and finality, said everything. "We ran another series of tests this morning," the doctor said, his voice heavy. "There is no brain activity. None at all. The machines are the only thing keeping her body functioning." Chad stared at him, his mind refusing to process the words. "I am so sorry, Mr. Henderson," Dr. Evans said, and this time there was real compassion in his eyes. "There is nothing more we can do. Your wife is gone." The words were gentle, but they were the most violent words Chad had ever heard. They were the sound of a door slamming shut forever. They were the sound of the end of the world. Gone. Ashley was gone. His beautiful, gentle Ashley who had nobody in the world but him. He was supposed to be her safe place, her family, her protector. And he had killed her. Mildred let out a low, guttural wail, the sound of a damned soul. Chad did not make a sound. He felt nothing. The black hole inside him had consumed everything. There was no more pain, no more guilt, no more anything, just a vast, silent, and endless emptiness. He stood up from the plastic chair. He looked at his mother, at this woman whose petty hatred had orchestrated the destruction of his entire world. And then he looked at Dr. Evans. "What happens now?" Chad asked, his voice a dead, hollow whisper that did not sound like his own. Dr. Evans looked at him, his expression filled with a deep, professional sadness. "What happens now," he said softly, "is that you will have to say your goodbyes. A nurse will be in shortly to speak with you about the necessary arrangements." The doctor gave them a final, somber nod, and then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the empty hall. He left them alone in the crushing silence of what they had done. As the doctor's footsteps faded down the long, empty hallway, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than any sound, Chad and Mildred were left alone in the small waiting room. Two people stranded on a tiny island in an ocean of what they had done. Gone. Ashley was gone. The word was not just a word anymore. It was a physical thing. It was the hard plastic of the chair beneath him.
It was the sterile, chemical smell of the hospital air. It was the empty space in the world where his wife, his children, his entire future used to be. A nurse came in a few minutes later. She was an older woman with kind, sad eyes that had seen this scene too many times before. She spoke in a soft, gentle voice. She had papers for Chad to sign, papers with cold, official words on them, like deceased and next of kin. His hand shook so badly that his signature was just a jagged, ugly line. He did not read the words. He just signed where she pointed. She asked them if there was anyone they needed to call, any family to notify. The question was a fresh stab of pain. Ashley had no one. He was her only one. The nurse did not know that she was talking to the man who was both Ashley's only family and her executioner. "No," Chad said, his voice a dry, rasping sound. "There's no one." The nurse gave him a small, pitying look and left them alone again. They sat there for what felt like hours. Mildred was still crying, her body shaking with quiet, pathetic sobs. Chad did not cry. He could not. The black hole inside him had swallowed all his tears. He was numb. He was empty. Finally, a security guard gently told them that they could not stay in the waiting room any longer. It was time to go. Time to leave the hospital. Time to go back to the house. The walk to the car was slow and dreamlike. The sun was out now. The sky was a bright, cheerful blue. It felt wrong. The world should have been dark and gray. The world should have been crying with him. But the sun was shining. People were walking by, laughing, talking on their phones, living their normal lives. They had no idea that his world had ended. The car ride home was completely silent. It was the same road they had driven down in a panic 3 days ago. Now there was no panic. There was no hope. There was just a thick, heavy silence that filled every inch of the car. Chad drove, his hands like blocks of wood on the steering wheel. He stared straight ahead at the road, but he did not see it. He saw her face. He saw her lying in the rain. Mildred sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. She kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Once she opened her mouth as if to say something, perhaps an apology, perhaps an excuse. But she looked at the hard, cold profile of her son's face, and she closed it again. She knew there were no words. There was nothing to say that could fix this. When they pulled into the driveway of the little house, it looked exactly the same. The flowers Ashley had planted in the front garden were still there, bright and colorful. A newspaper was lying on the porch. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful. But it was a lie. The house was not a home anymore. It was a tomb. He turned off the engine. Neither of them moved to get out of the car. They just sat there, in the silent car, staring at the house. "I can't go in there," Mildred whispered, her voice trembling. "You will go in," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You will go in and you will look at what you did." He got out of the car and walked to the front door. His hand shook as he put the key in the lock. The door swung open and he stepped inside. The house was exactly as they had left it. The messy pile of Ashley's clothes was still on the floor by the door, though they were dry now. A faint dark stain was still visible on the porch where she had fallen. He walked into the living room. A cup of tea that Ashley had been drinking sat on the small table beside the sofa, half full and cold. A maternity magazine lay beside it, open to a page with pictures of smiling babies. He walked into the kitchen. The pots and pans Mildred had used to cook their last meal were still sitting on the stove. The plate of food she had made for him were still on the counter, untouched and cold. He walked down the hallway towards their bedroom. Her scent still lingered in the air, a faint smell of the soft, floral shampoo she always used. He pushed open the bedroom door.
The bed was unmade, the sheets and blankets a tangled mess from where he had dragged her out of it. Her clothes were still scattered on the floor where he and his mother had thrown them. The room was a perfect, frozen picture of his crime. He stood in the middle of the room, and the numbness finally began to break. The black hole inside him began to fill with a pain so immense, so sharp, that it brought him to his knees. He fell to the floor amidst the clothes of his dead wife, and a sound tore out of his throat. It was not a cry. It was a roar of pure animal agony. It was the sound of a soul being ripped in two. He did not know how long he knelt there, lost in the storm of his own making. But eventually he heard a sound behind him. He looked up. Mildred was standing in the doorway, her face a mask of fear and guilt. "Chad," she began, her voice a weak whisper. "Son, I never meant for this to happen. I just wanted—" He stood up slowly. He looked at her, and the grief in his eyes hardened into something terrible, something cold and sharp and deadly. "You wanted what?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You wanted her gone? Well, congratulations, Mother. You got what you wanted. Are you happy now?" "No," she cried, tears streaming down her face again. "No, son, of course not. I loved you. I was just trying to protect you from her. She was lazy. She was disrespectful. She was my wife," he screamed, the sound echoing through the silent, empty house. "She was my wife. She was carrying my children, and she was good. She was the only good thing in my life, and you took her away from me." He took a step towards her, and she flinched, taking a step back. "You came into my home," he said, his voice shaking with a rage that was terrifying to behold. "You came into our happy home, and you filled it with your jealousy and your hate. You lied, you manipulated, you poisoned my mind until I couldn't see the truth anymore, until I couldn't see the woman I loved. I looked at her, and all I could see was the monster you told me she was." He was standing right in front of her now, his eyes burning into hers. "I did it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "My hands, my foot, I did it. But you loaded the gun, and you put it in my hand. You were the one who told me to pull the trigger." "I'm sorry," she sobbed, her whole body shaking. "Chad, I am so sorry." "Sorry?" he said, a bitter, broken laugh escaping his lips. "Sorry doesn't bring her back. Sorry doesn't bring back my son and my daughter. Sorry doesn't fix this." He stared at her for a long, cold moment. The woman in front of him was a stranger. She was not his mother. She was the architect of his damnation. "Get out," he said, his voice flat and dead. She looked at him, confused. "What?" "I said get out," he repeated, his voice rising again. "Get your things, pack your bags, and get out of my house. I never want to see you again. As long as I live, I never want to see your face again. You are not my mother. You are nothing to me." Mildred stared at him, her mouth open in shock. This was not how it was supposed to be. She had done all this for him, to get him back, and now she was losing him forever. "Chad, you can't mean that," she pleaded. "Where will I go?" "I don't care," he said, turning his back on her. He walked over to the scattered pile of Ashley's belongings on the floor. "Just go." He heard her sobbing as she left the room. He heard her go into the guest room and open her suitcase. He heard her packing, her movements clumsy and rushed. A few minutes later, he heard her struggling to pull her suitcase down the hallway. He heard the front door open, and then he heard it close. He heard a car start in the driveway, and then he heard it drive away until the sound was gone. And then there was only silence. He was alone, completely and utterly alone, in the house that was once his home. He knelt down again among the clothes. His hand touched something hard and square under his sweater. He pulled it out. It was the little wooden box, the box with Ashley's mother's things. He held it in his hands. It felt heavy. He slowly opened the lid. Inside, resting on a piece of worn velvet, was the small silver locket and the faded photograph of a woman with Ashley's smile. He had not just killed his wife. He had extinguished a whole family. He had taken the very last pieces of a woman he had never even met, and he had thrown them away. He closed the box, holding it tightly in his hands, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. And he sat there, on the floor of his empty bedroom, in the middle of the wreckage of his life, and he finally began to cry.
The tears, when they finally came, were not a cleansing rain. They were a storm of acid, burning his eyes, scarring his soul. He sat on the floor of the bedroom, clutching the small wooden box, and he cried until there was nothing left inside him but a raw, hollow ache. He cried for Ashley. He cried for the son and daughter he would never hold. And he cried for the man he used to be, the good and loving man who was now dead and buried under the weight of what he had done. He did not know how long he stayed there, lost in his grief. Hours passed, the sun began to set, and the room grew dark around him. The darkness did not scare him. It felt like home. It felt like what he deserved. But then, a new feeling began to rise up through the fog of his sorrow. It was a cold, sharp, and primal feeling. Fear. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, a powerful, direct blow. They knew. They knew she had not just fallen. Sooner or later, someone would come asking questions. Someone would come looking for the truth. And in that moment, a switch flipped in Chad's mind. The grief was still there, a giant gaping wound in his soul, but around it a wall of ice began to form. It was the instinct for survival. He had destroyed his life, his family, his future, but he would not be destroyed. He would not go to prison. He would not spend the rest of his days in a cage paying for his sins. He had already lost everything. He would not lose his freedom, too. He stood up, his movements stiff and robotic. He looked around the bedroom, at the scattered clothes, the unmade bed. This was not a room of grief anymore. This was a crime scene, and he was the criminal. He began to move with a strange, cold purpose. He went to the closet and found a large black trash bag. He started picking up Ashley's clothes from the floor, one piece at a time. The soft maternity dress she had loved, the sweater he had bought her for her last birthday. He shoved them all into the bag, his hands working mechanically, his heart a block of ice. He put the little wooden box carefully to one side. He would not throw that away. He stripped the sheets from the bed, the ones she had been lying on, and stuffed them into the bag as well. He gathered every trace of her from the room, every small thing that was hers, until the room was bare and sterile, like a hotel room where no one had ever lived. Then he went to the front door. He knelt on the porch, the same spot where she had lain, and he began to clean.
He found a bucket and a scrubbing brush in the garage. He poured bleach and strong soap onto the concrete, the chemical smell burning his nose. He scrubbed the dark, faint stain until his knuckles were raw, until there was not a single microscopic trace of her blood left. He cleaned until the spot was lighter than the rest of the concrete, a pale, clean scar on the face of his home. When he returned to the house, it was clean, it was empty, it was silent. He had erased her. 2 days later, they came. 2 detectives in plain clothes, a man and a woman. They knocked on his door, their faces serious and professional. Chad had prepared for this. He had showered, he had shaved, he was wearing a dark suit. He had practiced the look on his face in the mirror, the look of a grieving, devastated husband. He invited them in. He offered them coffee. He sat on the sofa, his hands clasped together, his shoulders slumped in sorrow. They were gentle with him at first. They offered their condolences. Then they began to ask their questions. "Mr. Henderson, can you tell us exactly what happened the night your wife had her accident?" the male detective asked, his voice calm. He looked at them, his eyes filled with practiced, well-rehearsed pain. "We had an argument," he began, his voice cracking just so. "It was a stupid argument. About dinner. She had just come home from the hospital and she was tired. I was being selfish. I was angry." He paused, taking a shaky breath, as if the memory was too painful. "She got upset. She said she needed some air. She ran out of the house. It was raining so hard. The porch was slippery. I heard a noise, a thud. I ran to the door and I found her there. She must have slipped and fallen." He put his head in his hands and pretended to sob. The woman detective looked at him, her eyes sharp and observant. "Mr. Henderson, the doctor's report mentioned injuries that seemed inconsistent with a simple fall. He mentioned a direct blow to the abdomen." He looked up, his face a mask of confusion and horror. "A blow? What are you talking about? She fell. She fell hard. Maybe she hit the edge of the step. Oh my God, did I do this? Did our argument make her so upset that she wasn't careful?" He was a master actor, turning their suspicion back on himself, but in a way that made him a victim of his own grief.
They asked about his mother. "She left," Chad said, his voice full of sadness. "She couldn't handle it. The grief. It was too much for her. She said she had to go home. She blames me, you see. She thinks the argument was all my fault." He gave them his mother's address and phone number, knowing she would be too terrified and too guilty to ever tell them the real truth. She would corroborate his story to save herself. The detectives looked around the clean, tidy house. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no mess. There was only the quiet, sad atmosphere of a home that had suffered a terrible loss. They looked at the grieving husband, a man who seemed to be torturing himself with guilt over a simple argument. They had their suspicions. They had the doctor's words, but they had no evidence. There was no weapon. There were no witnesses who would speak against him. There was only his word against the shadow of a doubt. They left, promising to be in touch, but Chad knew they would find nothing. He had cleaned up every trace. He had erased every clue. He had committed the perfect crime. In the days and weeks that followed, Chad played the part of the grieving widower perfectly. He arranged a small, quiet funeral for Ashley. Since she had no family, almost no one came. He stood by the grave, a solitary, tragic figure in the rain. He sold the little house. He couldn't live there anymore, not with the ghosts that walked its empty rooms. He quit his job and moved to a different city, a place where no one knew his name where no one knew his story. He had gotten away with it. He was a free man. But his freedom was a prison more terrible than any cell. He lived his life in a cold, gray, empty world. He never remarried. He never had other children. He never found happiness again. Because every night, when he closed his eyes, he saw her. He saw her face looking up at him from the wet porch, her eyes full of fear and love just before he kicked her. He heard the sound her body made when it hit the concrete. He saw the faces of the son and daughter he had murdered before they were ever born. He was haunted. He had erased her from the world, but he could not erase her from his soul. Dear viewers, and so this is a story with no happy ending. It is a story of a great love destroyed by a small evil. It shows us how the whispers of jealousy and manipulation can turn a good man into a monster. It is a story about a mother who, in her twisted attempt to possess her son, destroyed him completely. And it is a story about Chad, the man who got away with murder, only to discover that his punishment was not to live in a prison of stone and steel, but to live forever in the silent, screaming prison of his own guilt, completely and utterly alone. Thank you for listening. This has been a difficult story to tell. If it has taught you anything, please let us know in the comments, and please subscribe to our channel for more stories that make us think about the choices we make and the lives they change forever. Always remember, at Virtuous Stories, we love you.